President Biden tested negative last night for COVID-19 and tested negative again today, not experiencing any symptoms. As far as the steps he is taking, since the president was with the First Lady yesterday, he will be masking while indoors and around people in alignment with CDC guidance. And as has been the practice in the past, the president will remove his mask when sufficiently distanced from others indoors and while outside as well.
That was the voice of Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre announcing yesterday that the President of the United States, Joe Biden, is taking precautions after the news broke that First Lady Dr. Jill Biden tested positive for COVID-19. COVID-19 is still very real. People are still being infected. In fact, people are still dying despite the massive propaganda campaign that is being waged against society to convince us of two things. They're trying to convince us that COVID-19 was never real. Actually, three things. That COVID-19 was a plandemic. And then they're trying to convince us that masks don't work. And they're also trying to convince us that vaccines don't work. Not only vaccines don't work, they want to convince you that vaccines are the reason we're seeing an uptick in so much cardiovascular health and distress and emergencies and deaths after COVID-19, despite the fact that COVID-19 is a cardiovascular disease. Let's dig into this propaganda, this concerted effort to make sure that we never wear masks again. Upon the news of President Biden choosing to mask after his wife tested positive for COVID-19, the response from the conservative echo chamber, the Republican echo chamber, the response from Republican candidates for president really is in lockstep with this agenda to maximize the amount of people infected with COVID-19. And I know that may sound hyperbolic, but after 4 years of this, it's hard to come to any other conclusion when we see people engaging in the most anti-science and the most amount of propaganda that I have ever seen in my life. Let's begin with this clip from Michael Smerconish on CNN. He has a weekend show. I've been on his show before. Here is his interview with Dr. Anthony Fauci, and I want you to listen to the very specific study that he references, trying to make the case that masks don't work. He references a very specific study, and then I have evidence for you after the clip. Listen in.
There is a perception out there by many, how many I don't know, that they don't work and that the data concludes that they didn't work in the first go round. Respond to that on masks.
There's no doubt that masks work. Different studies give different percentages of advantage of wearing it, but there's no doubt that the weight of the studies, and there have been many studies, indicate the benefit of wearing masks.
I'm going to refer to one of them. You've heard about it before. I heard about it from a number of radio callers. Brett Stevens in The Times talked about Cochrane. Put that on the screen. The most rigorous and comprehensive analysis of scientific studies conducted on the efficacy of masks for reducing the spread of respiratory illness, including COVID-19, was published last month. Its conclusions, said Tom Jefferson, the Oxford epidemiologist who is the lead author, were unambiguous. There is just no evidence that masks, make any difference. He told the journalist Mayan Damasi, full stop. But wait, hold on. What about the N95 masks as opposed to the lower quality surgical or cloth masks? Makes no difference. None of it, he said. Well, what about the studies that initially persuaded policymakers to impose mask mandates? They were convinced by non-randomized studies, flawed observational studies.
Now, I want to pause there. Dr. Fauci did respond, but Dr. Fauci's response was woefully insufficient. I mean, to the point where I don't know why he even went on the show. Now, before I give you the response to this very specific study, I want us to pause and reflect on what Michael Smerconish is forwarding to his entire audience on CNN. And not to mention, this is the clip that the right-wing echo chamber has been sending across social media to the tune of 20 to 30 million views. Right. So this went well beyond just the CNN audience. This has been something that has been specifically promoted to promote the idea that masks don't work at all. I hope you really absorbed what this Cochrane study is suggesting and what Michael Smerconish is forwarding, and that what, quite honestly, Dr. Fauci let slide by. Because it didn't take much research to find. It didn't take a lot of work to go to Cochrane.org and to find their statement on this specific study in which they said the following, quote, many commentators have claimed that a recently updated Cochrane review shows that, quote, masks don't work, which is an inaccurate and misleading interpretation. And they went on to say this, quote, the original plain language summary for this review stated that, quote, we are uncertain whether masks or N95 P2 respirators help to slow the spread of respiratory viruses based on the studies we assessed. This wording was open to misinterpretation, for which we apologize. These are the very people who conducted the study that Michael Smerconish shared on his show. The very people, Cochrane, they have come back to apologize for their misleading headline and to make it clear that commentators are misrepresenting their data.
How do we get beyond that finding of that particular review?
Well, it's pretty easily. Number one, your producers should have caught this and not allowed it to go on air. But then number two, Dr. Anthony Fauci, if anyone should know this information, it should be you. But unfortunately, he didn't know.
Yeah, but there are other studies, Michael, that show at an individual level for individual. When you're talking about the effect on the epidemic or the pandemic as a whole, the data are less strong. But when you talk about as an individual basis of someone protecting themselves or protecting themselves from spreading it to others, there's no doubt that there are many studies that show that there is an advantage. When you took at the broad population level, like the Cochrane study, the data are less firm with regard to the effect on the overall pandemic. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about an individual's effect on their own safety. That's a bit different than the broad population level.
Now, listen, I've been doing political commentary and debate for some time, and I know when a person knows what they know, and I know when they don't know. Dr. Fauci was not aware of or not willing to share the fact that the Cochrane study, the very people who conducted the study at Cochrane.org, look it up yourself, have stated that the interpretation that is being forwarded that masks don't work is misleading. They stated that back in March. This is September. There's no excuse for Smerconish or Anthony Fauci to not know it. But at this point, we are living in such a inundated stage of propaganda that I'm not sure if they didn't know about it. I feel like perhaps they did know that this study was debunked. They're too high up in their positions. Their researchers at CNN could have easily found this, and Anthony Fauci should have had this on a speed dial. But what happened? Fake news about masks not working has been spread all over the internet just in time for the latest surge of COVID-19.